Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's genealogy Q&A with Natalie. So today's session is going to be a little bit different than some of our presentations, and this is a workshop style. So today we get to spend the entire time asking questions and diving deep into finding out about all of the different kinds of resources and ways to research all these families that we have become just enthralled with. So just for a little bit of background, I'm sure lots of you have already started some of these family trees. I did some, I asked around and asked some people that I knew were studying the various trees. And so just a few of the different sort of first branch trees that we have. We've got the Lister family tree, we've got the Belcom family tree, the Norcliffes, the Walkers, the McLeans, and that includes the Stewarts, the Denistons, the Camerons, the Campbells, the McLeods. There's a Rain family tree, Inman family tree, Radcliffe, Dalton, Ray, Wilson. So those are just a few of the trees that people have been working on. So of course, if you have just started your Lister family tree or even your own family tree, or you haven't started yet and you're wanting to, you can use this opportunity to chat with Natalie and ask all the questions you want to get started on that. And so with that, I'm going to hand this over to Natalie so that she can introduce herself and get us started.
Hello, I'm Natalie. I am a completely self-taught genealogist. I run a small business called Genealogy Stories, where I also blog quite regularly. And I'm, to say I'm obsessed with history would be a big understatement. I host fortnightly history talks with all sorts of different historians, one of which included Packed with Potential, which is how I met Chantel and the crew and learned about the amazing work that you're doing. So I am, funnily enough, not a walking encyclopedia, so if there's anything that I don't know, I'll try and go away and look at it for you. But yeah, if you'd like to fire some questions at me, you can use the little raised hand icon, and then I can try and pick them off. But I did notice Chantel sent me a list before. So if I just share my screen a sec, there we go, quite big list of questions, and I thought if I ran through the answers to some of those, that might give us a good place to start. So some of them were about how do I get started, especially if I don't have any family or I don't have that kind of inherited documents or any of that. And I'd say the best place to start is with the first birth or marriage that you know of. So if you know your grandparents' names, for example, ordering their marriage certificate will hopefully then give you their father's names, and then you can start looking for a birth. So birth and marriages kind of connect like pieces of a jigsaw. Obviously a birth certificate has hopefully got two names on it. Hopefully it's got a mother and a father's name. Sometimes it has just got a mother's name. And then hopefully you'll find a marriage certificate that has the same father's name and a similar occupation, and you're starting to kind of connect those pieces. Obviously, in reality, it's not always that easy. You get people changing occupations, changing names, and all those kind of things. So certainly in the Victorian period, you've also got the 1841 right the way through to the 1911 census, and then jumping forward a bit, you've got the 1939 National Register in England. So using those details on the census to connect back to your birth, marriage and death certificates will help. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is right from the very beginning, if you start looking at the social history and the context of not only those records and why they were created, but what was going on in your ancestors or the lives of the people that you're investigating, you'll start yourself off on the right foot then. So I hope that helps. I'm just gonna, please feel free to raise your hands or just shout in the chat. Okay, so the other question that I get asked a lot is, do I have to subscribe to Ancestry or Find My Past or My Heritage or some of those other big sites? And I can't lie, it does help considerably, but certainly it's worth trying to get as much for free first as you can. and there is quite a lot available free. So you've got free BMD, and that also includes free Reg and free Sen, which are by Free Genealogy UK, I think it's called in full. And they have, not only do they have full lists of birth, marriage and death certificates and indexes and ways of searching those, they've also started producing them for census, and they've got quite a lot of parish registers that they've transcribed as well by volunteers. So they're a good place to start. And then certainly on the birth and deaths, you can search. So, you know, when you search Ancestry, you get the births come up. Ancestry search function for searching for birth, marriage and death indexes is dreadful. It's just really, really difficult to sort. And it's quite easy to miss somebody. So I always hop over to free BMD, which I think is a lot easier to sort. It organizes people by quarter, and you can, once you've found somebody or somebody who you think might belong to you, you can then pop on to the General Register Office website, and that includes things like for births, it includes details of women's maiden names, and for deaths it includes their ages. Those details aren't on Ancestry and they're not on free BMD, so you've got to do a bit of jumping around to get the pockets of information. And that's where we had a birth, marriage and death index, and it's recently been updated in recent years, but a lot of the websites are using the old indexes. And obviously Family Search, which I suspect a lot of people will have heard of, which is the site that's connected to the Mormons. It's absolutely massive. You do always have to bear in mind that a lot of the details on there are transcriptions, but it's worth checking to see whether the originals are held with a local Latter-day Saints church, because if they are, you can apply for somebody to look them up for you. And there's full details of how to do that on Family Search. And then there's obviously all your local family history societies, many of which have transcribed parish records. So if you're looking for family and you know that they're from a certain area, like Yorkshire, for example, then it's well worth going to look at the Yorkshire Family History Society, for example. And then the other thing I'd say, it's also worth Googling the location. So for example, if you Googled Sheffield records, you'd probably come across the Sheffield indexes, which are a group of volunteers that have indexed not only parish records, but trade records and apprenticeships in like things like cutlers and trades that are relevant to Sheffield, and that's all free online. So always Google like really location specific as you can. And then the other place that you might want to jump into is your archive catalogues. So if, for example, you've already researched quite a bit of your family tree and then have had to take a break from it, or had to take a break from paying for one of those big sites, then what you could do is jump into the archive catalogues and see what's available at the archives. And some of it you might find is available to download, or just gives you enough clues to kind of tide you over. And then there's newspapers. So the British Newspaper Archive, you do have to pay for, but you do get 10, I think it's 10 free lookups. So that's worth knowing about. And you've also, if you're looking at Welsh ancestors, there is Welsh newspapers online, which is free. And then if you've got anyone that went over to Australia, or part of the family went over to Australia, then check out Trove, which is the Australian newspapers. But quite often, if a family went over to Australia, you might find British news in the Australian newspapers, because they were reporting things that were of interest to expats, basically. And the other thing that I would advise doing is signing up for Ancestry and Find My Past anyway for a free account, and just keeping an eagle eye out on free trials, because they do run them fairly regularly, or access to part of records quite regularly. So I hope that was a bit whistle stop. It gives you a few places to get started. Okay. And then the next question that I noticed there were a couple of questions on is how to visualize a family tree, and how and difficult relationships, and how to manage all your research. Now you could use something like Ancestry and build your tree in there, but actually I'd really advise looking at some family tree software. So I use a piece of software called Family Historian, and a plugin that comes with that called Ancestral Sources. And another really popular family tree software package is called Family Tree Maker, and you can use that with Mac as well. They're basically databases, but it means that you can cut your data in lots of different ways. So if you wanted a report that showed everybody by address, for example, you could do it, which makes life a lot easier. So I just noticed a question, is there any rhyme or reason for where records end up in archives versus libraries versus city records, etc.? Is it random? I suspect it's not entirely random and there is a system, but I can't say I know what that system is necessarily. I should think it's probably quite a complex answer to do with copyright and all those kind of legal bits and pieces. So it's a good point. It is always worth checking kind of archives and libraries and museums as well sometimes. But normally if you ask an archive whether they've got something, if they don't have it, they tend to know where it might be. So that's normally my first port of call. So yes, so with family tree software, you can cut it in lots of different ways. So you could cut it by address, for example, and you've also got inbuilt chart functions, which means you can look at different types of charts. So you could look at a pedigree chart, which is that direct line only, and then you could look at a full chart. You could look at descendants only and that kind of thing. So it's got more flexibility than something like Ancestry. I find with really complex families, I end up just drawing it out on a piece of paper in front of me to visualize it. Or if you've got something like Microsoft Visio, or even something like Canva. I don't know if you've come across Canva before, which is a graphic design kind of website. It's very cheap and it's very easy. In fact, there's a free version which you can do loads on, but you could basically build out, like add a block and type in the name yourself and kind of do it manually. Yeah, I love Canva. And the other part, aside from your family tree software, which will record like things like all your sources as well, the other thing that it's really worth doing is creating a note or logging system that really works for you. And there are lots of different software packages that you could use for this as well. So you could use old-fashioned pen and paper journal, like one of those project books with tabs is quite handy. Or you could get fancy and use something like, I use a program called Notion, which again is free, that allows you to build like spreadsheets, but also Notion with an N. It allows you to build spreadsheets, but within those spreadsheets, you can have embedded pages. So I could build a spreadsheet and click on somebody's name within that spreadsheet, and it could take me to a page about them, and that page could have like to-do lists and a calendar and all sorts of jazzy things if I wanted it to, although mine's normally quite rough and ready. There's also Evernote, which is quite handy. It's got a tagging system, so you can tag your notes, and I used to use that. I've since kind of moved away to Notion just because I like playing around with tech. That's the caveat. If you do quite like apps and text, you can get a bit lost down this. So there's lots of really good YouTube videos about Notion, Evernote, and OneNote is like the Microsoft own version of these more sophisticated note-taking systems. And if you pop onto YouTube and give them a Google, you'll get a video with an overview, and then you can decide which one you want to go and check out. So Walter's just said Coda. I've not tried that. I'll have to go have a look at it now, because that will lose half a day just fiddling around with tech. And then within those logs, obviously you want to record not so much your sources if you're using family tree software, but all your thinking. So it's really easy when you start researching your family tree to think, oh, I'm going to remember how I know that this is the right person, or how I've narrowed it down, or what my doubts are. But you don't, you forget, especially as your tree gets bigger and bigger. So having some sort of note where, you know, even if it's a simple one line where it's like, I know this is the right person because all the census details matched with their birth, marriage and death certificates. Even if it's something really, really simple, it will definitely help you when you get further and further into it. And similarly, so will a really, really good filing system. boring as that sounds. So I like to color code my files, and I file by surname, and I have a folder for each of my grandparents, and then inside those grandparents folders are subfolders with surnames. And when a woman gets married, or if a woman gets married, she then transfers over to her husband's folder that surname. So that's my rule. Don't have to follow that rule, as long as you know what your rules are and write them down, because you will forget. And keep following it, you'll be able to find everything that you need, which is, sounds really simple, but it is really, really easy to get into a mess with it. And then inside my surname folders, I have folders for I call them birth, marriage, and death, but I include burials, for example, in the death folder. And then I have address as a folder, which includes things like census and electoral registers and anything that is kind of address based, or that was the purpose of the record. The purpose of the record was somehow address related. And then I might have other folders like military or school or newspapers, depending upon what I find. So that was the getting organized question. And then I noticed there were also a couple of questions about why do people marry cousins, and why do people not stick to the same spellings of their surnames or even their first names? And my comment on that really was that, like, context is everything. So though there were some basic dictionaries before 1775, the kind of, as we would recognize it, kind of standardization of spelling in a dictionary didn't happen until 1775 with Samuel Johnson. And of course, it's not like he published that dictionary which half the population couldn't read, and everyone went, right, that's it, that's how I spell everything. You know, it kind of took time, and things changed. So, you know, you've got to kind of put the literacy of the time into context as to why surnames changed. And then also, don't forget that people didn't have passports and driver's license and things with their name and their date of birth on them that they used all the time. So you might find ancestors sometimes record their dates of birth differently, or, you know, and that's because they probably didn't celebrate birthdays in quite the same way we do as well, especially if you were poor and you didn't see your date of birth written down, you know, on a daily basis like we do. We use ours all the time. And that kind of led me on the cousins marrying. Again, that's a historical context thing. If you're a woman and you can't inherit money, then how can you keep that money, help keep things in the family? And marrying cousins is the kind of perfect solution to that. So the answer to that question is again about historical context. It's about looking at the rights of people within the time period. And that kind of leads on to my next point, which is to use timelines to help you. So actually, I find that primary school timelines, so things on like BBC Bite Size, are actually really, really helpful, because they don't go into so much granular detail, and they kind of give you a high level overview of the different events that were happening at the time. And they're quite a good place to start. So, but yeah, if you just Google Georgian timeline, you'd come up with lots of already pre-done timelines that would tell you about the various events that were going on. And then you can kind of bear those events in mind whilst you're researching. So, and it'll also give you clues about what records you might want to go and look up. So, you know, in 1815, you've got, is it the Battle of Trafalgar in 1815? But you've got the Napoleonic Wars going on at that time. You know, therefore, if you have a male ancestor, it might be worth just checking whether he was in any sort of naval or military service, because there was a war going on at that time. So there would have been a bigger recruitment drive to get people to sign up. You'd probably always check, but you'd probably just pay a bit more attention during those war years, for example. So I just seeing Patty asked a question about what about church records. Would you mind expanding? I'm not quite sure what you mean. And I'm just going to quickly scroll through the questions.
Well, I visited a church in England, and someone handed me a book, said your relatives have signed here, and then handed me a book of genealogy that actually was my mother's side of the family. So I'm thinking about all of the records for the Gentleman Jack folks that, checking all the church records, of course, the Minster, but there may be other places. I don't know how to search them. That was an accident for me.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty rare to kind of turn up somewhere and find that they've already done a full genealogy. But normally, if there is something like that, normally it will be recorded somewhere, like at the archives, for example. So it's always worth going to things like archive catalogues and just typing in the surname that you're researching, if it's more unusual, especially, and saying what comes up, because you might find that if you typed in, I don't know, something like my surname, unfortunately my lot were all dirt poor, so it wouldn't exist. But if you typed in Pithers into an archive catalogue, I can guarantee that any Pithers that come up are probably going to be connected to me somehow. And if an article came up that said, family tree of Pithers, I'd want to access it. So those kind of archive catalogues are probably the best place to start with that. Obviously, more well-known families or more wealthier families are more likely to have those kind of documents as well. So actually just Googling some of the family names, like their full names, is worth doing to see whether anything that already exists pops up. And that funnily enough, that reminds me as well about we were having a brief conversation just before we went live, and I mentioned the Guild of One Name Studies. So some people like me get a little bit obsessed with their surname and trying to match up who everybody is, and end up diving into one name studies. And there is an organisation called the Guild of One Name Studies where you can register your surname interest. It's worth having a search of their site to see whether the surname that you're interested in has already got somebody studying it, because some of the one namers have absolutely huge databases of names that they've looked at and tried to tie people up with, and they might be a good shortcut route. And you also get one places, which is exactly the same thing, but people doing one place studies. And again, some of them have got absolutely reams of information. So it's one name studies and one place studies. I'm just going to scroll back through the chat, see if there was any. I'm new to family. Is there a convention for when a child's name is being used twice? So Anne Lister had an older brother who died before she was born called John, and a younger brother who lived into childhood also called John. That is a really common. That is very common. And actually, I've got an article on my website on genealogy stories. If you go to my website, Genealogy Stories, there's a tab called Learning Centre. And that's got a search box. And if you search up surnames, I did a whole article on different naming practices, because it varies depending on where people were. But it was very common to name people in kind of a set fashion, like the eldest son being named after the paternal grandfather, and then the eldest daughter being named after a paternal grandmother. There's quite a set pattern. And if you see, it can be really helpful, because if you have a family and you see that they've done that for the first or 2 or 3 kids, you can start to guess what their children's names might be, and that might help you locate them in the census, for example. Obviously, it's not foolproof. Some people start following that pattern and then change their minds halfway through. But that practice also of naming a child after an older sibling that's died is, again, not uncommon. I've come across families where there's been 3 or 4 Johns, for example. It was I take it as a determination to make that name continue, just in case we ever run out of Johns in the world. And as a standard way to differentiate against them, you could just use first or second. I don't think there's any particular standard. And certainly when you draw a family tree, you would just have their birth and death dates. You wouldn't label them as first or second. But when you're doing your own notes, or when you're drawing out the tree yourself, then whatever works for you. I tend to just have the death date personally, normally because they died in infancy. So and some people color code as well. So some people put names of people that died without having any children into a certain color, like slightly grayed out or something, so that they know that they're not that they don't need to go and try and search for that person downwards, if that's something you're trying to do. Sorry, let me just scroll back. Yeah, somebody put in the note, like United States, your local public library should provide Ancestry. That is also true in the UK. A lot of libraries have Ancestry and Find My Past, and certainly during the height of the pandemic, they were available free via your library at home as well. So it's worth checking to see whether your library's still doing that. Okay. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through chat. Yeah, finding Catholic records. So yes, there is a lot less digitalized. Find My Past for England certainly has the largest Catholic record collection. So Find My Past would be the first protocol. There are non-conformist records on both Find My Past and Ancestry. So what I would do is on both sites, I would go to the A to Z. So if you go to the actual search index and type in the place that you're interested in, then you can see all the records that each site has that belong to that place. And in fact, actually, a lot of the record sets, when you do a generic search of any of the big websites, actually, they obviously show you the most popular information. So if you were to type in a name, you'll most likely get birth, marriage, deaths, census. If somebody's already accessed and added military records, for example, to the family tree, they might pop up quite close to the top, but actually that's just the surface of the records that they have. And there's records on Ancestry, for example, that haven't been indexed, but they are still available to search. So for example, if you went to Ancestry's index and typed in London and scrolled through, you would see that they have all of London's poor law, so like the workhouse records. Although they have indexed some of them, they haven't indexed all of them, and there is a separate collection on Ancestry that haven't been indexed, but you can look through the records by place. They are in a bit of a mess in that particular collection, but that's because they were in a bit of a mess in the archives originally. So, but they are there. So you can access all the London workhouse records, which is incredible. I was looking through the lunatic asylum registers of Poplar the other day, which is on Ancestry, but you wouldn't find it from searching. So you've got to go to that index. And similarly, at one point, I'm not sure it's still the case, you need to check, if you were looking in the First World War, for some reason, although this Silver Medal Award, which is like the award that a lot of people got just for being injured, so it's a award that a lot of people got, for some reason, although that collection had been indexed, it never used to show in the search results. So whatever you're doing, it's always worth going into that search A to Z index and either putting something in about the subject that you're looking for, like war or the place. I don't know anything specifically about Yorkshire, I'm afraid. It's not an area that other than Sheffield, which I happen to have a client who had a Sheffield ancestor link. But I believe the Yorkshire family, I think there's 2 Yorkshire Family History Societies off the top of my head, and I'm sure I've heard really good things about them. Okay, would I suggest trusting local government or church records more? Do you have things there? I think they have both got equal capacity to be completely wrong. So I would treat everything that you find with the air of suspicion. Just generally, I always try and seek to disprove things rather than prove things. So it's quite easy to fall down the wrong trap, the wrong rabbit hole if you're looking to prove things, because you'll start saying things like, oh, well, they've got the same name, well, they've got the occupation, so that means that it has to be the same person. But actually one of them died 50 years before the other, and you haven't looked that up because you're seeking to prove something rather than disproving. So if whatever you're looking at, and that's quite a good way of wading through the ancestry hints. is to try and look at for reasons why it can't be the same person or why something can't be right. And obviously, if you can't find any reason why they're not the same person, then you start to feel like you're on more of the right track. And generally, I would say when you're really first starting out, try to ignore the hints on Ancestry. They can be really, really useful, but I think when you're first starting out, they can be quite dangerous, because following them, one, means that you're not learning how to do the research yourself, and secondly, that you're not performing the actual search yourself, so you're not seeing any other possibilities that might come up and then learning how to discredit them yourself. So certainly when you're first starting, I'd say try to ignore them for a little bit, and then kind of come back when you've already done some research. Okay, I've been reading people's wills. Yeah, so before 1858, wills were held at a local level, so they went through local courts. So it's much more complicated. So if you go to the National Archives has an absolutely brilliant guide on how to research wills before 1858, and actually just generally the National Archives has some fantastic guides. So when in doubt, Google wills pre 1858 National Archives guide, and you'll be flying. Okay, I think, how are we doing? So many items on Ancestry, such as baptism, marriage records, only have the text information, not the images. No, it doesn't mean that the images don't exist. It means that they have only been given access to or decided to purchase access to a transcription copy. And actually, it's always, if you can, it's always really well worth trying to view the original. You never know what extra pieces of information might have sneaked onto the originals. So Chantel, go ahead.
Yeah, so speaking of the originals, is there an easy way to find where those originals are if they're not? Because there are some places where I found the transcribed words, but it doesn't say like where I can actually find an image for it at.
Yeah, so there's two places that I try. One's called Gen UKI, so GENUKI, and you can search by place, and then it will tell you what churches are in the area, and then it will try and drive you down to where records are. And actually also Family Search is quite good for that as well. It has like little tables in their search guides with where bits and pieces are. So yeah, and it's certainly with stuff that's transcribed on Ancestry, is also always well worth popping over to Find My Past and looking in their index and seeing whether they've only got the transcription version or the full version, and vice versa as well, just as a quick thing to do. I feel like I've been talking really fast. I hope I'm just kind of gone lots of information.
No, this is great. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. You've been listening slow. That helps. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask, or if there's
Do I do consultations? I do. Yeah, I do a mix of things. So I provide done for you research services, and I provide one-to-one lessons, or I wouldn't mind doing small group lessons if there are a small group of you interested. But I am quite booked up. I tend to be booked up at least 3 to 6 months in advance. And you'll probably find that's the same with most genealogists, especially at the moment. Things went a little bit nuts over the pandemic. I think a lot of people started tracing their family trees and then wanted help with it, or wanted somebody else to do it for them when they realized that it's not, it's a bit more involved. art. Okay. I can tell you about my favorite resource of all time, if that helps. So whilst you're thinking of questions. So my absolutely favorite resource of all time is newspapers. And with newspapers, the absolute best thing about them is, yes, you can go in and you can search for your surname, but you can also search by location, which means you can find out what was going on in the area where your ancestors were living, or the person you're interested in was living. And you can find out what they were gossiping about in the local pub, who was having an affair with who was arrested for burglary, who, you know, when the street got street lighting, things like that quite often be in the newspaper. You can look at, obviously later as well, you can look at, you know, what adverts were they looking at, and what were they buying from their local newspapers. And you can, you often get opinion pieces as well, so people writing in to complain about stuff. You know? And it made me realise that how much more political my ancestors were, even my working class ancestors, than I had realised. So I found out through newspaper research that some of the locals in Notting Hill in the 1850s were a bit fed up with their road being full of potholes and basically unusable, and having to pay tax despite having these unusable roads. So when a tax inspector came to the local pub to go collect the rates, instead of giving it to them, they barricaded him in the pub and held him at gunpoint in a refusal to pay for their taxes. So you can find all sorts. I found an ancestor that fell off a ladder and hurt his ankle at the age of 80. So they were always having a really, really slow news day. But yeah, the newspapers are the most absolutely incredible, best resource in the world, if you ask me. They're absolutely full of stories.
Yeah, so for the newspapers, so in my Belcom research, I found so Mariana's niece, who was named after her, Mariana Percy Belcom. So she never married and she lived in York. And so starting in 1851, she has what starts out as a lady's maid, Elizabeth Hopkinson, and each census it changes. So she goes from lady's maid to companion, and then the two last censuses are visitors. But in all of the newspaper records that they are named in, so anytime there was a wedding, they are listed together as giving the same gift together. And so like finding all those newspapers, like that was very interesting. I didn't know, first of all, that they would list gifts in the newspaper for weddings, but then to find that piece, that when I first saw that written down besides the census, that's what made me think, ooh, I feel like something is more here, because why would a lady's maid be listed in a York newspaper with her boss as giving a wedding gift?
No, absolutely. That's really unusual. No, I love that. That's absolutely brilliant. That's brilliant. You'd never know that otherwise. No, they are like the most fantastic resource. So what are your favorite sources for Jewish genealogy? I haven't done a great deal of Jewish genealogy, to be honest. I'm trying to think. I did have a London client with Jewish roots, and I'm trying to think what I used. There was a Jewish shelter in London, which most Jewish immigrants came for at one point. I think it was in the 1880s. That was useful, and I can't think of the website off the top of my head. And there is a big Jewish genealogy society that's worth following. But there's also a really, really brilliant Twitter user, if you're on Twitter, called Effortlessly Cat. She's based in the US. She speaks about 10 different languages, and she has Jewish ancestry herself, and she kind of specializes in that area. And yeah, it gets much more complicated because of the travel of Jewish people into different countries, and the expulsion of them from other countries, etc. So I couldn't claim to be particularly knowledgeable about Jewish genealogy, I'm afraid. Are your clients using? Yes, a lot of my clients are using DNA to try and test for traces of ancestry. So obviously, the further back you get, the less chance you have of having that little tiny bit of DNA still within you, in order to find somebody else that also matches with you. But I always think it's worth a punt. The only thing I would say is if you do take a DNA test, do so, make sure that you're prepared for any results that you get, because it does sometimes throw up unexpected surprises. So I found out that my nan's mum, so my great grandmother, I found out that her father was not the person that was on her birth certificate, which was, you know, obviously not too particular. Well, it was a surprise, but it wasn't particularly shocking or upsetting for me. But when I told my nan, she was a little bit like, well, I'm quite glad that I never got to know my granddad then, because I would have been a bit disappointed at 90 to find out that he wasn't really my granddad. So yeah, so you do have to kind of go in with a bit of an open mind that obviously you might find out more than you wanted to. And if you do decide to do DNA, I've got a article on my site about how to get started with that and the first few things you can do with it. And there is a really, really excellent site once you kind of, if any of you are trying to analyze your DNA results and kind of analyze your matches, there's a really good site called DNA Painter, which I'd recommend checking out. My site's genealogystories.co.uk. Okay. Yeah, so I think we're heading towards the end of time anyway, so I thought that I might end by telling you a story to illustrate the importance of historical context. So I want you to imagine that you are 16 years old and you find yourself pregnant, and the father of your employee is the father of your baby. And then I want you to imagine that you are in 2020, or you're in 1960 in Ireland, or you're in 1880 in London, or you're in 1841, like my ancestor, in a little tiny village in Oxfordshire, because the historical context of all those moments, of all those 16-year-olds, is all completely different depending on where they were living and when they were living. And I just thought I'd wrap up with the with that as a little story to illustrate the importance of historical context, because you can have all the records in the world, but if you don't keep the historical context in mind, you're missing half the story, really. So and then sorry, just a bit confused by something in the chat, so not to worry. So you can find me, like I said, at Genealogy Stories, where I have a learning centre, and I also have all the twice removed episodes, including the one with Packed with Potential. If you're interested as well, I also run a club called the Curious Descendants Club, which is all about writing. So it's all about writing either your family history or just writing historical stories. And you can find a link to that from the Genealogy Stories website as well. So I feel like that was quite whirlwind. If anyone does want to drop me a line, then feel free. There's a contact form on Genealogy Stories. And I also do daily emails with tips. So you can sign up to that from Genealogy Stories website as well. Okay.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Natalie. That was great. And that is like, I've taken notes, and I've already told everybody that they probably won't see me for a couple weeks, because I've got all sorts of new researches to find. So get ready, welcome family tree.
Look forward to seeing what you find out.
Awesome. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much.